meets mind, we ponder, we dream.
Sounds good. All right. Well, thank you so much for coming on the show. It's great to finally meet you face to face in person because this is how we do it over Zoom, right? So why don't you tell us a little bit about yourself and your organization and what you're passionate about?
Sure. My name is Carolyn Ross, and I'm a professor at Washington State University in the School of Food Science. I have been here for 20 years.
Wow.
No, I know.
But
My
food
degree,
science is like the one thing I'd love to do. If I wasn't into technology, I'd love food science because I love food, unfortunately.
yeah, as do as do I. So my undergraduate degree is in nutrition. I'm originally from Canada.
Oh,
Undergrad,
yeah, me too.
really? Where are you from?
I'm from Toronto.
I did my master's degree, University of Guelph.
Oh, no way. Cool.
Yeah, all
I always
world.
love having fellow Canadians on the show. How about those Oilers? No, I'm just kidding.
I know. Too much fingers crossed. Um,
Sorry, go ahead.
yeah, well, originally from British Columbia, from
Hmm.
interior BC, and then moved across and did my PhD at Michigan State University in food
Nice.
science and environmental toxicology. And I started off in nutrition, wanted to be a dietitian. That just didn't work out. That just
Mm,
didn't align. And so I switched to food science for my master's and then kept going from there.
nice.
Yeah.
Nice. So what are you doing today? Like, tell us all about it.
Yes. Well, I look at sensory evaluation and how people perceive things, and then I also look at how instruments perceive things.
Hmm.
So my training was originally in food chemistry and more within food analysis. So I wasn't working with people, I was just working with instruments. And that's something that I found interesting when I was working with instruments is yes, we can detect X or Y, but who cares? So what? Like, can people perceive that? That just naturally came up because when we're talking about food, people are going to be eating it. And so
Right.
you can measure things 10 ways to Sunday, but if it doesn't actually have an impact on the food, is it important? And so that's what got me more into the idea of sensory science.
So what is the instrument measuring? Like if it's not measuring some particular taste, like if I mean when I taste something, I can say, oh, that's umami or that's salty or that's whatever. Can the instrument actually tell if it's salty or umami or whatever?
Well, some of them can. So our electronic tongue, what it does is it provides a holistic response. And so you just get,
Sorry, I love that phrase. Our electronic tongue.
I know, and rather sadly, it does not look like a big tongue. It looks like it's just a circle with beakers around it. So it's not even as exciting as it
Could you
sounds.
could you make it look more like a tongue though? Like if you wanted to, just for marketing purposes, our electronic tongue and
I would love to. I'd love to have a big tongue with a syringe that you just put the
yes.
on that. That would be awesome. I thought,
That would look fantastic. It would be great for the publicity shots. Our electronic tongue. Anyway, go ahead.
so what the electronic tongue measures is a holistic response. So how different samples vary or compare to a reference sample. And
Hmm.
then you can draw some connections to what the taste differences can be. It doesn't identify specifically what the differences are, though. But we have other instruments that measure aromas. So we use a different instrument for that. And that we
Mm.
can identify what the aroma compounds are. We can also measure for texture profile. So what is the texture of the product? So for liquid, how thick or thin is it? Or does it have particulates? Or if it's like a piece of cheese or a crisp, like how much force does it take to smash it or to push a probe through it? So there's all these measures that we can take as well. But our question always comes back to how does that relate to what people are doing? So how are
Mm.
people eating things or tasting them or smelling them?
So you actually have a device that can like macerate, like chew things?
Well, just a couple of times. So there is an electronic mouth, as one might
You
imagine.
get the electronic nose, you get the electronic tongue, you get the electronic mouth.
And that actually goes up and down and mimics the chewing.
Right.
But we don't have that. We have it's called a texture profile analyzer. It's a probe that just pushes through something.
Oh,
So
okay. So none of these things look human, which is
no.
unfortunate, but
Yes, sad but true.
so what made you go into like what made you go into this space? I mean, obviously you mentioned you love food earlier, but what is it that drew you to this particular line of research?
Just the idea of taking what we're measuring with instruments and how is that relating to what we're perceiving as people. I find that extremely interesting. And then I've gotten my research has flowed more into what about the response of specific groups of people, which I find very deeply fascinating. So I've gone into the area more of the texture perception by, first of all, older adults, because just determining how their texture perception is changing and how can we design foods for that population. And then also children with Down syndrome. I've also gone into that space as well. So how can we design foods that are better tailored for that very specific population? So not the idea that there's one perfect product for everyone, but there's perfect products for different people. And we really have to understand the characteristics of the individual group of people that we're developing the product for. And I find that very fascinating because you get that crossover with physiology and anatomy and oral processing and all these other things. It gets really complicated, but just really interesting.
Were you surprised that there's so many differences between people, or were you surprised that there's so many similarities between people?
I'm still surprised that there's so many similarities between
Oh,
people.
really?
Yeah, I mean, there's variation in perception. Don't get me wrong, there is. But just given all of our life experiences and all the other information that goes into, or all the other things that we take into consideration when we're assessing if we like something or not, that we actually we do have variability in our data, but you'd almost think that there'd be more. Like I'm sure you have specific foods that on the whole, they seem, many other people like these foods, but you may have had a bad incident with it back in the late 70s, like I had with root beer. And I can't.
Marshmallows.
Yeah.
Marshmallows over a fire.
There you go. And you wouldn't know that. You wouldn't that's not it's very, very hard to predict just from having people taste something. Then you have to ask people or somehow assess or determine their memories or their nostalgia or all these other factors. So food is so complicated and it's so tied up in not just what we perceive, like the sweetness of the marshmallow, but whatever happened with your marshmallow incident, which you don't.
I ate too many. That's all. It was a campfire. They were delicious. I'm like, okay, this is great. And then I just ate too many. And it's like, now I can never eat another marshmallow over a fire ever again. Even the smell of it, like does something to me. So is there any way I can get over it with this electronic tongue? No, I'm kidding.
I find that so interesting. Just the sense of aroma and our sense of memory, just how that's so tied in together.
Yeah. So how do you tie the nose and the tongue together then? Have you ever tied those two together and have them work together on something?
We've used, so the electronic nose measures volatile compounds. So those are compounds we perceive either up our nose or in our mouth as flavor. And so we have done analyses where we've looked at products for their volatile compounds, which is using the electronic nose or some other instrument, and then the non-volatile compounds, which are the compounds we perceive in our tongue. And so there certainly are relationships between those, absolutely. But there's going to be things that you perceive in your mouth that you don't perceive when you're sniffing. So like sourness, for example, or sweetness or umami. Also, when we take a product in our mouth, it's so complicated. So often if we're sniffing a glass of wine, we may perceive X number of compounds. But when we put it in our mouth, well, now there's sweetness and astringency and sourness and all these other things. So it just becomes more complicated, maybe more difficult to pick out compounds.
Well, this is super fascinating, but what do you actually use it for? Like, what are your... I mean, I would love to have these things. I mean, the only thing I can think of is like, oh, can you create a device that can tell if my cheese has gone bad? Because, hard to tell. Like, what are the use cases, I guess, that you're using this for?
Yeah, actually, it's a great example you bring up about cheese. We're using it right now for cheese. But within food science,
Stilton is my favorite, by the way. It's outside of some of the Greek cheeses, cassetti and stuff like that. But go ahead.
Within food science, it's often easier to define a lack of quality than define quality. So it's easier to pick out, if you have certain compounds present, then you think, oh, that's gross, I'm not going to eat that. Or it's easier to pick that out than if you've got a high quality product. Sometimes things are just in balance, and so it can be harder to to measure quality. Rather, it's easier to measure lack of quality. So we've used it for analyzing, for example, some apple juice samples were brought to us from a company, and they said they were getting consumer complaints that they taste gross. Pretty broad. we have to back up and
Don't
figure.
they have any tasters on staff that could have been a little more specific? Probably not, right?
Yeah, this is consumers sending it back saying gross. And
Yeah.
so we have to, it's kind of interesting because we're then sort of detectives to figure out, well, what is the gross aspect? And it turns out it was a residual cleaning agent that was left, and it got into the next samples and all of that. So we can
Interesting.
use it to determine those kinds of things. It's been super useful in the pharmaceutical industry because a lot of the pharmaceutical companies are trying to create blockers, or the active ingredient in pharmaceuticals is often quite bitter. And so the idea is, how can we block that perception of bitterness so that we have high compliance with people taking their, for example, malaria drugs, or other drugs for children. And so what we can, it's very useful for that, because using human subjects to test pharmaceuticals is very, very difficult and very fraught. So if we can use an instrument to allow us to predict the bitterness of a certain type of bitter blocker or a certain type of medication. So for example, we'd run the instrument, figure out where children's Tylenol is, and then they may have a whole bunch of other coating agents that they're trying to see which ones coat that active ingredient and make it more similar to children's Tylenol. So that's been a great application. And also as a way of reducing the number of samples that go forward to sensory. So we've used it for spicy things. And if we have 80 salsas, for example, that's a lot to try for someone. It's a lot, even if you're.
I mean, you got to train, but how do you train the tongue? I mean, doesn't somebody have to taste all those salsas and then tell the tongue, this is what I'm tasting? Like, how does the tongue know what it's tasting?
Well, we have to do that too. We provide those sensory data as we get them, so we input those data. And then it does do some modeling as well based on the responses that it already has and the sensory responses that we'd already input. But absolutely, yeah, you eventually want those sensory data. It's just going to take some time to build up that library to compile with the electronic tongue data.
Right. So how does AI fit into this? Is it all this stuff going into AI, and then AI is producing reporting, or where does the AI fit? If it does.
Yeah, it does. Yeah, there's definitely being used a lot more within sensory, a lot more within consumer sciences, as you know, just as a way of collecting even the millions and millions of comments that are out there about various products. But there was a recent study that was looking at beer, and it had 250 kinds of beers and something like 200 chemical measurements. And so the electronic tongue could be one of those measurements that goes into the model. Because ultimately what you want to do is have all these inputs and be able to predict, is a consumer going to like it? That's what we would like to do. And that's so hard. But yeah, we try.
But isn't it almost impossible? Like, you say that there's a lot of similarities between people, but I think there's like so many differences that it's almost impossible to say, okay, this tastes good, ship it. And you're still going to get a lot of people saying, yeah.
No, I agree. I should go back and say, I mean, I still think that there are a lot of differences among people, again, just that we're able to even tell a story at all. Yes, it is. And the fact that we're all different people like different things. I mean, just the idea that there's not one perfect product for everyone. So it's going to be more difficult, but that is where the electronic tongue data would fit into things, is at that front end, where it would provide information in order to go into a model to help understand what people might like.
Right. But it can't do that psychological piece, right? It can pull out that, but it can't tell that there's a bad psychological connection between a food or a smell and a particular subject.
Yeah, exactly. That's where it's really complicated, and how we even do that when we're testing in person becomes tricky, because it becomes, how do you ask that question, or how do you gather those data? But that's a huge piece of it, and also the context in which people are trying it. And again, the experiences of nostalgia. There's so many other factors that feed into it that we don't know. And so if you have enough input, the idea with AI is that you have enough data, a lot of data going into the model in order to help predict.
Right.
It won't replace people for sure, because we're very complicated, and because sometimes we don't even know what we like or what we're going to like, or what, until you actually try it.
Right. But I can see to a point where, like, when you look on Yelp and you're looking at restaurants and you're looking at reviews and you're going, okay, are these people enough like me for me to like what they are liking? So if this could somehow be used in that capacity, so that it can detect, I don't know, a flavor profile or a taste profile or for whatever, and then line it up against somebody else's profile, wouldn't that be cool? I mean, is that something that you're looking at?
It's not something I'm looking at, but I'm sure somebody else is looking at it, or they will be. I think that's really
It's like you need to bring your digital head with the tongue, this nose and the mouth into the restaurant and feed us
yeah.
and then have it record all the information.
Yeah, and and the more data you can collect about that person, the better.
Yeah,
Because then that can help explain or help you understand what it is maybe about them that you would have in common with.
right,
Yeah.
right. So I read that this has been happening over the last little while because I have another newsletter called AI Daily, and every now and then I get a letter, a note saying that, oh, now they've got a tongue, now they've got a nose, now they've got it's like how long will it be before we have sort of like a full set of senses, or are we pretty much already there?
I think they keep working on it and keep developing it further. So we're there with the various sense organs as
Hmm.
far as being able to perceive various factors, but it becomes more sophisticated over time. And again, it's a way of measuring, of trying to mimic human perception, but also human manipulation. So not
Right.
just that I'm going to touch something, but I'm going to squish it too. So
Hmm.
how do we measure that? So it's getting more complex. And so
Right.
they continue to build out the technology.
Right. So you've been mentioning sensors so far, but do you have any actuators, like anything that can actually create the flavors and the textures and the other things that you're sensing?
You mean as far as in the food themselves?
Yeah. So like right now you can sense all the different foods coming at. Like, is there any way, but you're not working on sort of like the opposite, like creating foods that taste like XYZ.
Well, we're creating foods that have certain textures. So
Okay.
yes, we are. Yeah. So built based on the results that we got with our older adults and also our children with Down syndrome, we're trying to understand first of all what foods and textures they like, and
Hmm.
then kind of building backwards. So yes, we are building out foods that have certain parameters that we
So
thought.
you're creating replicators. So you can actually create replicate a sandwich or some type of food that tastes like a particular thing.
No, it's more just the texture itself. So we might
Okay.
be, for example, dissolvability. Like we're just with food ingredients, we're able to manipulate the food products.
Okay. So you can't create like a chicken sandwich or something like that. Not yet. Or it's
Not
it,
yet. Not yet.
or you could have like a baby food that tastes like a chicken sandwich for someone who, would like a chicken sandwich but maybe can't macerate a chicken sandwich. Is
Right.
that
Yeah,
is that
that
can
would
you
be
get to
great.
that point yet or you're not quite
I think
there?
we can. I think we can. It's so hard though. Well, building flavor profiles to mimic something else because there's so many compounds that are present in these like chicken sandwiches. There's hundreds of compounds at
Right.
various concentrations, and they feed into each other separately. And so it's trying to build back from a natural sample can be quite tricky. So
Right.
we tried to do that with apple. We tried to rebuild apple flavor from just with a series of compounds. And it was almost apple, but that wasn't quite, you could tell what we were going for, but it
Yeah.
wasn't quite there.
We should partner up with the people who do Lay's potato chips because they do every year they do some flavor,
Mhm.
and a couple years ago they did Greek gyro flavor,
Yep.
and it tasted almost exactly perfect, and I'm like, wow, it's
Yeah.
amazing what they could do with food science nowadays. So if you could like actually create any flavor, could just think how great it would be for the weight loss industry if you could create something that has the flavor of something that people crave but has much fewer calories. I think that would be phenomenal.
Yeah, I think so too. And there's a lot of flavor chemists out there doing such things and building back, reverse engineering essentially and looking at flavor profiles. Yeah, I look
Right.
at those chips as well.
The Cuban sandwich chips are actually pretty
Yes,
good. I don't know if you tried those.
I saw them yesterday. Buy them.
They got
Yeah.
the ham, the mustard, the pork, and everything. I'm sorry, we're talking food, so he's got to be like that. Well, this is great. So where do you see things going in the future? I mean, how far away are we from sort of putting together almost like a device that you can actually feed stuff into and that can detect everything and then sort of spit out a flavor profile that then you could then take for someone to replicate?
Well, I think the flavor profiles were getting closer. I think texture, not as much. Texture is
Okay.
really, it's very dynamic as well. So when you first put a product in your mouth, you perceive hardness, but then as you chew it, saliva mixes, it changes its presentation. So it's very dynamic. So texture is a lot trickier, but flavor, I think we're getting closer. And same as with taste as well, as a way
Mm,
of mimicking those. And I think our understanding of interactions of flavors and tastes has come a long way as well. So that's really just, if you have lower sourness, how does that balance with the sweetness, like those kinds of things, how different things play off each other. So I think we're getting closer, but I still think we're some ways away for the texture.
So have there been any recent breakthroughs in the space that allow you to do this, or is it just sort of slowly been getting better and better over time?
It's slowly been getting better over time. We did a lot of work, did some work with people over in math to do some more complex modeling, and that was about 12 years ago or so, 10 years ago. And so now with AI, it's just much more approachable. It's easier for us to do the kind of modeling work that we're interested in. And being able to use large data sets. So even looking online and looking at data that are currently available. So being able to work with the data and then also having that AI tool has been really helpful.
Mhm. Very cool. So are you looking at like what are the outputs are you looking at out of this? So you mentioned earlier that you were outputting certain types of foods that for specific populations. Are there any other outputs that we could be looking forward to?
We're looking at early detection of flaws or compounds. So ways of allowing the processor, way of allowing them to determine if their product is flawed, because then they can mitigate that flaw earlier. And so maybe that's in wine, maybe it's in cheese or within apples or within whatever product, but we want to, the earlier you can detect that there's a problem, you can address it. And
Mhm.
so that is also a great application for this as well.
So do you
Yes.
think this is going to put winemakers and cheesemongers and people like that out of business? The people who are, or is it just going to enhance what they're doing?
I think it's going to enhance what they're doing. There's just nothing replaces a person as far as,
Mm,
which is nice to know. But we're very complicated, and there's a lot of factors that go into our perceptions. I mean, in it, whether we like something or not, of course, is going to be, there's so many other factors that feed into that, but just how we perceive something and how we manipulate it in our mouths or with our fingers, it's really hard to mimic that with any sort of instrument.
mm. So are you able to program these things with particular types of individuals? Like you were saying earlier, you had older individuals and Down syndrome. Are you able to sort of program it with this is something like someone like that might want to taste it a particular way, or is that something else that comes out of it?
Not yet, but that would be really interesting stuff. We don't
Mm,
do that yet, but I think that would be really cool as far as how people are perceiving things, or even if, for example, if you have a low saliva flow rate versus a high saliva flow rate, and that can be a function of number of medications that
right.
can decrease saliva flow rate. So what if that is an issue? I mean, we've done some of that work. We've worked with the electronic tongue where we've squirted saliva in there, but we've had a steady amount of saliva. But what if you put a little versus a lot? What is the response of the tongue? That would
Right.
be a really interesting thing to study. But
Yeah,
we
this is like astronomy. There's just so much to it. It's hard to figure. How do you get to all of this every day? I mean, it's insane. It's an insane amount of work because there's so many flavor profiles and there's so many tastes and there's so many types of food and there's so many. I mean, that's a huge, huge project.
It really is. And so often it becomes, well, what industry are we working with, and what is the product, or what are the questions that they have? It allows us to be able to come up with a smaller piece. Otherwise, you're
Right.
right, absolutely huge. And this has given me a couple of really good ideas as well. So thank
Of course. No, so where do you see, so it's time to think like a future. It's the year 2034, 10 years out. Where
you.
do you see this in 10 years? I mean, do we actually have this kind of device that can taste everything that you just sort of feed something into it and it'll, I mean, where will we be?
I would I would love to see more data sharing with among labs so that we can share the
You
electronic
guys aren't sharing data? Come on.
not as much as we should, to be fair.
What?
So that we've got these bigger models so that we can account for as much variation as possible. I see really figuring out how we can measure more of the ways that we're perceiving food, so more of the individual variation, as well as the context cues and what's more of the psychology behind the individual. But
Mm,
we always have to keep in mind, of course, what are we trying to predict? Are we trying to predict, intensity of sweetness? Are we trying to predict if someone's going to like it? But I think that the more data that we can collect, which is a function of how we can measure it, because measurement is so tricky, but that's what I see. And I see these models being a lot more complicated. It's not just having 5 or 10 variables inputting to use that to predict what we're seeing for liking or perception or whatever, that you're seeing hundreds of variables feed in. And also looking at more toward the front end of the cycle. So for example, it would be neat, like if we work with lentils because we're in Washington State, or with wheat, but not just looking at what is the starch content of the wheat, or what is the protein content, but even looking at what are the genetic components of the wheat, what is its let's see, pesticide, what am I trying to say? Resistance. So looking at all the parameters that we possibly can to say that if the wheat is being bred to be resistant to pesticides, it's going to have certain properties, and those certain properties may trickle down and present in the product, the finished wheat, in a certain way. So it's including as many variables as you possibly can, and not just X predicting Y, but all those things at the front end as well.
Wow, that really makes me think. It's like there was always this desire, and if you watch Portlandia episode 1, of looking at the supply chain, like the full supply chain of the food, like all the way back to where it came from. And wouldn't it be amazing if you could actually use these devices to detect all of the history of the food from where it started? Like, is that it? Do you think that would be possible at some point?
I think that would be so interesting, because I think that's part of the argument now, is that it makes a difference where your food comes from. So obviously, so if you're thinking, okay, I'm going to measure bread, okay, fantastic. But traditional food science has said, let's look at the flour and all the ingredients. But what about the provenance of those ingredients? Like actually putting that into the model, and not, and so making it a lot more complicated, but saying essentially what you're saying then is everything matters at some level. You don't know what the contribution is going to be, of course, the AI will figure that out, but that everything matters somehow. And I find that really interesting.
Yeah, because you could have an oven could be set a degree too high, or it happened to rain on the day that they harvested that wheat or something like that. So I mean, I don't know if we can ever get to that level of detail, but knowing more out of the flavor profile would be fantastic.
Yeah, and just how everything's interact together, because everything's complicated. But how the amount of moisture they receive, maybe that interacts with another ingredient, the protein content of a different ingredient that in the past we haven't thought were related to each other, or our model would have been more simplistic. And so I see that those models becoming a lot more complicated.
Right. Well, can you actually do that kind of breakdown where it can detect the amount of protein in something based on the taste profile or the flavor?
You would just analyze it separately so if you had a bread sample, you would analyze it, you do your sensory evaluation, but then you could also analyze it for protein and amino acid composition and water and everything else as well.
So the tongue doesn't do that. It's not that smart.
No, it's not that smart yet.
So it's not like that, Commander Data eats something and goes, oh, this is like 17% protein. It doesn't quite work that way.
That would be fun, but not yet.
So this is actually, any consumer products do you think might be able to come out of this thing? I mean, I know, so you're working with a lot of sort of like food companies and big organizations. Do you see any commercial products coming out of this?
Out of the e-tongue
for consumers?
That is a good question. I see it more as a tool at this point for developing products, or for understanding what people like. So to say that people really like these types of beers, and then really characterizing them and using the electronic tongue to gather data to help explain perhaps why they like them. Yeah.
So you don't foresee sort of like an electronic sniffing device which can say, oh, this cheese is bad, this wine is good, hey, don't eat that, that doesn't meet your dietary restrictions? We're not there yet?
Well, I think we are there with the technology. More broadly speaking, it's a little tricky to run the tool, and also for data analysis. Like actually, you have to have a certain amount of training to be able to run the tools themselves. But I think the information could provide that, as long as we have a big enough library. So if you have enough cheeses entered in to know this is a good cheddar and this is a bad cheddar, and then we run hundreds and hundreds of sample, it builds up the library, it builds up the binary designation of accept or reject, or however you want to measure it. So as long as you have a big enough library, that information could be provided.
Yeah, because I want a device that actually I can pass over food and it'll go, yeah, you can eat that, or you can't eat that, or you should be able to eat that, or you can't eat that. Do you think we'd ever get to that?
I do. Yeah, I think for those type of measurements, it depends how much sample preparation. So for the E-tongue, we have to mush things up with water.
Yeah.
But for the other one, it's the compounds that are just emitted from it.
Mhm.
So if you're talking about just passing it over, you're looking at those volatile compounds, and I think absolutely. Some of it is, so that's where you've got compounds that if they're present at a certain concentration, they're problems.
Right.
But oftentimes you have different compounds, and if you've got a certain compound A is present, but compound B kind of offsets it, then it may not be as problematic. So you really have to understand the relationships among the different compounds. But there
Interesting.
certainly are compounds, like in wine, TCA is one compound. Basically, if it's there, it's a problem. So if you can detect it, it's problematic. But there's a lot of cheeses and other products like that. They're going to have different variations in these compounds that are going to be problematic at certain concentrations, or if another compound isn't present to offset it.
Right.
So we would,
Would you be able to use it for anything though? I mean, at some point, I'm assuming if you have a big enough model in the background
Mhm.
and you pass this electronic nose over whatever it is, it should be able to detect what it is based on the scent. Is it, do you think if you had a big enough model, you could do that?
I think, yes, I do. I think if you have a big enough model, you'd be able to do that because you'd understand more about the variation within that product and what you would expect to see.
Right.
It might be an issue if it's a very new product, unique product, or it's really badly spoiled or something that's driving it outside of the
Right.
model, outside of what you've normally seen. But I think
Yeah.
you could.
So that's telling me I can also have a model for my preferences at the same time, and I can compare it against my preference model, and it can go, yes, you'll like this, or no, you won't like this.
Yeah, could do that. Yes.
Wow. That's what I want.
That would be
So you're
very,
building it.
yeah.
I'd love to see something like that. And it can, not only that, it can also go if I'm trying to change my diet or something like that. You could pass it over and go, oh, those are French fries. No, bad for you. Do not eat. So it would be able to detect all of that stuff as long as it matches it against my model. So
Yep.
when are you going to start working on that? Soon?
Tomorrow.
Awesome. I'm looking forward to it.
Yeah, that's a cool idea. I like it.
Well, thank you so much. This has been great. So if somebody wants to get in touch with you, what's the best way?
Via email. So
Mhm.
I provide that cfross@wsu.edu.
Okay. And then anything else about your work? Like, do you have a website or LinkedIn or?
I do have LinkedIn and I have a website as well, and I can provide that information to you, but I'd love to get in touch with people. I love hearing new ideas. It's very,
Awesome.
yeah, love it.
Cool. So I'll put all that stuff in the show notes. So if anyone wants to get in touch with you, they can do it that way. So thank you so much. This has been great.
Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Talk to you later.
Bye.
Bye.
Pixels and philosophies merge and mold, a future untold, unseen.